Greetings viewers, Eric the Car Guy here with the pressure washer going in the background. I've got nothing to do with that. Anyway, today I am working on my youngest son's 2005 Honda Civic, and I am hoping to solve a persistent oil leak that I've had on this engine, this 1.7 liter Honda engine. I have replaced the oil pan gasket, the front seal, the rear main seal, the valve cover gasket and grommets. I've also replaced the seal that goes into where the distributor used to go on this engine. There's a plug in the side of the cylinder head. I've replaced that. Yet I still have a persistent oil leak, not a big oil leak, just a little one that keeps finding its way to the ground. Now from the looks of it, it looks like it's coming out of the front of the engine where the cylinder head meets the engine block, hence the reason I'm going to replace the head gasket today. The head gasket was only about 25 bucks, and I believe that's the only gasket I'm actually going to need during the process of this. But before the end of this video, you'll know exactly what I'll need. And I will also link parts and tools and things down in the description. But instead of me standing here talking about what I'm going to do, why don't we jump in right now? Here's the mileage at the time of this repair. I'm going to start with not only disconnecting the negative battery cable, I'm just going to remove the battery in its entirety. It just creates a little more room, and it's honestly, in my mind, not that much more work. Here's a better look at the underside of the engine. And like I said, it's not a big leak, it's just a little one. I've cleaned this several times. It seems to come down from the front and just sort of wick along this where the transmission mates up to the engine. You don't really see it a whole lot back here. Normally there would be a splash shield here and some plastic clips holding it on that you'd need to remove. Not that difficult. This is the tool that I use for that. And a little bit of WD-40 on the plastic clips really helps them come loose. Once you've got that splash shield removed, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna drop the exhaust down, and I've got it easy since I've had it down before, fairly recently. You may need to use heat. There's also a fastener holding the catalytic converter to the engine block right here behind the O2 sensor. I'm just going to remove the one from the block because the catalytic converter is going to have to come off. It's part of the exhaust manifold. This fastener is a 14 millimeter. And I'm going to keep this fastener with the other fasteners for the exhaust pipe. That way I've kind of got a clue as to where it goes. While we're here, the O2 sensor wires clipped in a couple of places. I would unclip it now. That will make removing that catalytic converter / exhaust manifold a lot easier. This engine uses a plastic intake manifold. You can see it right there in the bottom of it. And it is supported on to the back of the engine block via those two metal supports that are coming down here and over here. I'm going to undo the fasteners on the back of the engine block to free up the lower part of the intake. These are 12 millimeter. Two on the one side and one on the other. An extension for this side. Sweet. See that plug just above the oil filter? That is to the coolant jacket. Now I'm just going to loosen it now, but I'm prepping myself for after I drain the radiator so I can drain the engine block before I remove the cylinder head. This helps avoid a big mess. At least that's my hope. But first we'll drain the radiator. The plug is a 19 millimeter. And that's why I knocked the exhaust loose first. I'm going to remove the oil filter. I will be doing an oil change. And you should if you're going to do a head gasket, because it's very likely that, well, you'll get oil and coolant mixing at some point during this process. And this sucks because this, I just recently changed the oil in this. Probably reuse the filter though. You might be able to see some of those fasteners that hold the lower part of the intake manifold to the cylinder head now. They're 12 millimeter. I'm going to remove all of those that I can and try to get these brackets off. They're 10 millimeter. Looks like you don't even have to take the fasteners all the way off. You can just loosen them up and the bracket should come right off, hooked in there. Again, you don't have to take it all the way off. That has opened things up a lot. I'm also thinking about disconnecting, this is the oil pressure switch right here, just taking that wire off. Don't be sad if the boot rips, because it happens all the time. Something else that might be helpful is just dropping this exhaust altogether. That really does open things up even more. These are nice and crusty. They're inspiring all kinds of confidence. One came loose. Maybe that one? I've got a crazy idea. But so far, I've only been able to knock 2 of them loose and 2 of them are stuck. I'm gonna use this, and I need to be careful because if I miss, the intake manifold's plastic. And honestly, I may have to take this axle out of here to do this. I don't know if that's loose or not. Worst part is I just simply cannot see. This axle's got to come out of here. If you want to see detail on this axle removal, see the video I did where I replaced the clutch or the transmission. I'll link them both down in the description for you. That makes for even more room, and I'm hoping that I can access those fasteners a lot better now. I think I saw it move. I did see a putty tap. Replace it with another one so that I don't have to worry about the crusties in the future, or when I go to tighten it down. Okay, that guy's out. Next. It was enough. I have no idea how you're gonna deal with that if you don't have that tool, because there's just simply no access, no room. You can barely get a wrench in there. So that one was actually a nut. I might recommend just taking the axle out just so that you can get to these easier. Like, life is so much easier without that axle in the way. The one next to that is also a nut. One next to that, also a nut. And the last one, I'm gonna try to get from the top because it's kind of blocked under here. Normally with these, I wouldn't even be concerned about the timing belt because I can access the tensioner bolt from the outside and I can lock it into place and everything. But this one has something of an auto tensioner on it. So I'm gonna have to dig into the timing belt, which I've recently replaced. If you are doing this and you are doing a head gasket on one of these engines, I highly recommend you do the timing belt and water pump anyway you're in there. But this will give you, well, some insight into that. Up here is the tensioner for the alternator / AC belt. You loosen this fastener, and then there's another one up top, and then there's another fastener in the front, or a wing nut in the front that you can loosen. I actually have a special socket for that. Anyway, I'm gonna do that now. Here's that special socket I talked about. It's just a cheap socket that's been modified with some cutouts to go around the outside of the wing nut. It's helpful though. It doesn't always stay on so great, but it does help. And believe me, I had to go through some effort to deal with these rusty brackets on this engine. It might be easier to get to this from the top, but at least that one's loose, and it should loosen up once I get up there. I'm plugging the crank sensor, and I'm just gonna loosen the crank bolt. That way it'll come off easier in a minute. It's 19 millimeter. Now before I drop this down, I'm gonna do one thing in 2 places. I'm gonna drain the coolant. Here at the radiator, again, if you have a splash shield here, remove it, and you'll have access to this. I'm just gonna undo this and drain this out. As I said, I just replaced the timing belt and water pump, so I'm gonna try to reuse the coolant. I have a special clean drain pan that I use just for situations like this. After draining it out of here, I'm gonna go to the back of the block and drain it out of there. Like I said, that's gonna actually make it so that when I remove the cylinder head, there shouldn't be coolant going everywhere. If you take the radiator cap off, this will come out quicker too. I think we're drained out now, at least to the radiator. Now for that plug in the back I showed you, I'm going to add my big catcher. I can't stress enough how not having this axle in the way is very helpful. That will save some time and hopefully a mess. I suppose this plug really doesn't need to stay out. Once it's drained, you know? Just make sure you get the washer back on there. And don't tighten it so much that you deform the washer. Just snug it up. It'll seal fine. Now that I believe I have everything taken care of underneath, let's work up top. In my mind, the hard part's over. I'm gonna remove the airbox assembly and all this, and you'd be amazed at how much this opens things up. I'm also going to remove the power steering pump and the alternator AC belt, also the radiator hose, the upper and lower on this, because both are connected to the cylinder head. Mostly this is going to be, these are 8 millimeters holding the air cleaner on, and then 10 millimeters hold a lot of the airbox on. So there's one there, one down here. See, it really does open things up in here so much. And I can access that last lower intake manifold bolt now. There's a air temperature sensor here and a couple of fasteners, and we should have this off. Yeah, it's like half the engine compartment was airbox. I'm not removing the intake manifold. I'm just gonna I'm going to take it loose from the cylinder head and push it back against the firewall. So there's no need to disconnect any of this stuff on the throttle body. I just need to free up the stuff that's going to the cylinder head. And the more stuff you can do that's a bracket, as opposed to trying to unclip it, probably the faster it's going to be for you. Now with a job like this where there's a lot of fasteners, I'll just take the fastener often and just get it started where it came out of. So these are both for the O2 sensors, which I'll be removing the entire manifold. Just leave that to the side. We aren't gonna have to mess with the starter because that's not connected to the cylinder head in any way. This is a ground that I made. The other one was rotted. Oh, well, that's not cool. So that's the coolant temperature sensor. I have to see if I can find one of those because the fact that that's broken, and I didn't break it, I found it like that. That's going to be a tough one. That's this line that's going back here. It's a large line and it has a short hose, which means there's not a lot of movement. Looks like there's a couple of brackets. At the very least, this one that should come off. That's connected to this harness and everything up here. It seems to be two 10 millimeter fasteners holding that on. All right, that frees that up. Looks like there's another attachment right down here for another bracket. That should probably come loose. So far, all of these have been 10 millimeter. Oh, that's interesting. So this pipe is moving now, which means there's likely an O-ring in here, which means I can likely pry it out of there. So that's what I'm going to do because I think that's going to be infinitely easier than trying to deal with that hose. Yeah, that helps a lot, unclipping the wire part of it. Also, yeah, WD-40 works for everything, right? Helps with this too. Yeah, there's no way to do this without making a mess. But that wasn't nearly as bad as it could have been. And honestly, I'm gonna clean out that opening, but I can reuse that O-ring. Still got plenty of meat on it. But that frees up all of this stuff over here. I'm gonna take this lower radiator hose off. FYI, I replaced the thermostat when I did the timing belt water pump and everything. I would say that if you're gonna go this far into this, to also replace the thermostat. And if it's me, I prefer the original equipment Honda thermostats over the aftermarket ones, like by a large margin. So if you're gonna replace the thermostat, I strongly recommend an original equipment one. I'm gonna see what I can do to eliminate as much of this wiring up here as I can and get that out of the way. Now, these kind of clip in and get a little weird, but like I'm gonna remove these as well, and just remember where they go, because you can mix these up, I think. It's also an excellent idea before you start doing anything with this valve cover, remove the dipstick and put it someplace else. You can break this plastic so easily. Well, my hopes of picking this up and laying it out of the way are really dependent on my ability to undo the connections at the alternator, which are possible. But that'll allow me to take this entire harness and lay it to the side, which I would love to do. Oh, well, there's one more going down below. Actually, it goes to a couple of things that one I've already disconnected. I previously disconnected the crank sensor from down below. It was right behind the crank pulley. But this one, just pull this cover back, and that's the cam sensor there. And then this, well, there's more stuff going to this. I was hoping it was just those two connections, but it looks like there might be more. Okay. That was clipped on in a couple of places. I'll try to show you when I get it out of there. There may just be one more connector here. Does that do it? Yes, it does. Okay, there was one more connector that was down behind all that mess. I'm not precisely sure what it was for, but it gets that part of the harness out of the way. Here is that thing that was clipped in underneath. It was clipped in two places, as I said. One place was right here. There's a clip on that side that I undid. And then behind it, there was another clip right here that I undid. I pulled back, and then there was that other connector that was there. Now, we'll disconnect the stuff from the alternator. Keep in mind that the battery was disconnected long ago. Usually a 10 millimeter on the back of the alternator. You definitely want to be sure that the battery's disconnected when you do this. Okay, and I'll take the nut, put it right back on. And then the plug should be a connector I can push somewhere. Excellent. I'm just going to take this fastener out here, that way I can, actually this whole bracket, because it's going to have to come out no matter what. A few more things to disconnect, and we should be done with the wiring harness. I don't mark any of this. I just lay it down, and usually the harness goes where it wants to, and I can usually suss out what goes to what. I'm winging it. If you want, you can label things. That's not gonna hurt. But like I said, I just lay it down, and things just seem to end up close to where they're supposed to be. For these clips like this, I just sneak in under stuff. That's why I use these angle pliers, and just sort of squeeze the connector so I can pull it up out of there so I don't have to break it. Fuel injectors. And this is what I wanted all along, was the ability to just do that. That makes my life easier. Like, so much easier. Just about there. The last intake manifold bolt is right here. I can totally get to it now from up top. And I imagine once I remove this piece here, this bracket, that there'll probably be a couple of more fasteners that I can access up here to get to stuff. Oh, wait, looks like they made like some extra long ones. There's one there and one here. Look like extra long 12 millimeters that they made to hold that on. Looks like there's just those two. These are 12 millimeter. I'm pretty sure I didn't do this, but I just found something. It might explain one of the missing nuts. Here's one of those special nuts that goes to, I believe, like a stud like this back here that might have fallen down. Okay, this is access for the evap system. You might have seen me tap into this in a previous video. There's a clip. I think I can sneak behind here and undo to move this. And I'm doing this because I can't really access that one bolt without moving that. I had to bend it a little bit just to get in there, but now I can see that fastener just fine. So that's a nut, a super specialized nut that goes on a stud there. There's the other one. It's loose now. I'm just gonna take it all and push it back off the studs. Everything connected to it, just move it all back. But that is one of the most difficult things. Ooh, looks like we'll be able to do some EGR cleaning while we're in here too. I was wondering what that other connector went to, and now I know. This right here is the knock sensor. And that's where the other connector went that went to that harness that connected to the cam and crank sensors. Let's see what I can do with this power steering pump. Break that guy loose. There's a 12 millimeter holding it on here. There's another one down below that goes through and on the other side. But those two 12 millimeters need to be loosened. And once they are, you'll be able to loosen this to relieve the tension. When I did the timing belt and water pump on this car, this stuff was pretty rusted and difficult to deal with. So I had to spend some time freeing all this stuff up. I had to use some heat. I'm glad I did it now because it's making this job easier. I wish I didn't have to do it at all, but you know. Remember that handy socket I showed you earlier? It's perfect for this. This will work on the one underneath too. I can't claim credit for this. I actually found it in a vehicle, but I'm pretty sure that this is why they did it. It's not perfect, but it certainly works for stubborn things like this is being right now. Like so stubborn, I want to go back in and clean the threads again and put some anti-seize on it. You should be able to turn this by hand. It's easy to reach underneath and get the belt. You hood prop need to go away because you are so in my way. And this is how we will deal with you. No more hood prop I'm fighting with. In fact, this vintage of Honda, you can just take these right out. Where were we? That's a funky little bolt that goes in through the bottom. This was a nightmare before, but that nightmare's been handled. These hoses are so in my way. 10 millimeter, by the way. This will allow me to just move the entire power steering system out of the way. All kinds of room now. So loosen this up on the alternator, and then I can take tension off the belt. Although before I do that, it'd probably be even easier to remove this bracket. And there's those 3 14mm fasteners, and the power steering bracket comes right off. And that will make it even easier to get down to that fastener. Plus, it's got to come off anyway. Remember that I already loosened the 12mm underneath when I undid the crank pulley. So loosening that, and then the wing nut down below. Yeah, this was all way more difficult the first time I did it. This part should be interesting. Getting the exhaust manifold off. We'll see how much is left of the fasteners underneath here. These are 12s that hold the top part on. It appears that the heat shield held on the top part of the exhaust manifold, so removing those fasteners opened up those holes. But I found something on this that I often find on these exhaust manifolds, and that is a crack right there. It also looks like it's leaking right over here. This, because it's connected to the catalytic converter, makes this a very expensive exhaust manifold. I am gonna weld it rather than deal with this. So I may make a separate video on that. In fact, I probably will, because there's a whole procedure involved. For now, I'm gonna try to get these 3 remaining fasteners off. I may have to get out the torch because they don't look so good. It used to be a 12. That one might cooperate. Thank you. The bolt biter sockets. They're usually good for stuff like this. Yeah, it's just sort of laughing at me. It's that same technique I had to use on the intake manifold. At least this was easier to get to. Not much left of that one. Let's see what we can do with this last one. Bolt lighters for the win. With that removed, I can get a much better look at my oil leak. Yeah, you can really see it there. Definitely coming from the head gasket. Well, as long as everything's still together, I can take the opportunity to do a little house cleaning. After you take it apart, you run the risk of getting dirt and junk down in there. We're in the home stretch now. Just gonna remove the valve cover, starting with the coil packs. I saved this for last to avoid getting debris and stuff down into the engine while I worked. I'm also gonna remove the plugs. It'll just be easier to do now. These are also new. I did these with the timing belt and water pump. But certainly something you would want to consider if you were doing this job. Well, these look excellent. I mean, they haven't been in there that long, but I don't see evidence of a great deal of oil burning or anything that would be an issue. Maybe a little bit on that one. But considering the life that this car's led, that's pretty decent. And what I mean when I say that is it was a cheap car to begin with, and it was probably never dealer maintained or by anyone who really knew what they were doing. So it was handicapped by that as a result. But it looks awfully darn good in there, right? That needed to be removed in order to get to these fasteners on the timing belt cover. There's 3 holding that on. Here's my new timing belt. Job 1 is going to be to put the engine in time. And to do that, I'm going to rotate it counterclockwise. That's the way this engine rotates until the timing marks line up. And then rotate it around Really easy without the plugs in it. That looks lined up there. And a little bit more here, and this will be lined up. Boom. Now everything's in time. I'm gonna try to get access to the tensioner without removing the lower cover. There's a plastic cover, or a rubber cover, I should say, here that comes off. It's sort of that funky shape. And I believe that I can get my Allen wrench in through here. After messing with this for about 15 minutes, I have come to the conclusion that you need psychic powers in order to get the Allen through there and positioned correctly. Therefore, I'm going to remove the crank pulley and the lower timing cover. That way I can access the stuff I need to access, and hopefully we can be done with this. This is why I loosened this before. It makes it so it doesn't necessarily come out of time when I take it off. See, it didn't even move. Don't lose that keyway. There's a little keyway in there. You lose that, your life is gonna suck. So there are fasteners here. There should be one here, another one here, and another one down in here. So 4 fasteners. The cover should be yours. All right, well, now I can at least see the tensioner. And what I'm going for specifically is I want to put the Allen wrench in here, in there, so that I can pivot this whole thing. You don't have to loosen this bolt at all. All you need to do is get the Allen wrench in there and you can move it. I'll tell you what size it is when I know what size it is. It is a 6mm. You can release tension by pushing back like this. You don't get a whole lot of movement, but you get just enough. And I'm just gonna try and pry it off from down here. But if you're replacing the belt, I say just cut it, be done. You can set the timing when you put it all back together. That should do it. Now I can finally get the cylinder head off. Thankfully, none of this top stuff needs to be removed, but there are 14mm fasteners holding the cylinder head on all around its perimeter. I suggest a breaker bar. And what I'll do is I will loosen starting at the outside and spiral my way inward, and I'll do just the opposite when I install the cylinder head. I think they're all the same length. I don't know. We'll find out here in a minute. And these are not torque to yield, so you do not have to replace them. The parts guy will try to sell them to you, but you don't need them. The only time you really need torque to yield is if you're looking at the torque spec and then they have degrees. So in other words, they say tighten to 35 foot-pounds and then tighten another 90 degrees. That is 9 times out of 10 a torque to yield fastener. But if the torque specs say torque to 35 foot-pounds, then 45 foot-pounds, then 70, then it's not torque to yield. Usually torque to yield come with a degree setting for the head bolt torque. These do not. At this point, the cylinder head should be mine. And yeah, like super easy. No need for a pry bar or anything. Just lift it right up off of there. Ooh. These cylinders don't look in bad shape at all, really, considering the mileage. And it's funny because oil burning, a lot of times I see happening on number 1 and number 4, oddly. But those look pretty good. Here's the other end of it and the gasket. And this is an MLS gasket, which stands for multi-layered steel gasket. I don't often find leaks with these, but this 1.7, well, let's just say Honda didn't do the greatest with it, in my opinion. Anyway, this is the oil return here and here. And this in particular, actually this one in particular is the area that I suspected the leak. So looking at that, you can kind of see it. There's like a little, look at that. There's a little gouge right there. I think, you can see that. I think somebody created this when they put it together. So I'm pretty sure that I'm going to solve my oil leak, but I think that's the origin right there. After all that work and all this time, it comes down to this, and something I believe somebody else did. In addition to that gasket problem, I took a closer look at the cylinder head, and you can see right there, there's a gouge. And between that and what's on the gasket, I'm sure that's what's causing the leak. Thing of it is, anytime you're using a multi-layer steel gasket, the surface preparation is key. In fact, the less you do, the better. All I ever normally do is clean things. The closer you can get to a mirror-like finish, the better. So you don't want to use any kind of abrasives or anything on here if you can avoid it. So this creates an interesting problem here since it's sort of a gouge. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to clean this all up and then see if I can find something to fill this area in, and then lightly sand it down smooth with the rest of it, and hopefully that will solve the leak. I'm also going to take some time to clean out this EGR passage, which is, well, you can see it's pretty grubby in there. I've reinstalled the oil filter that you may be able to see down in there, so that none of the debris from this goes back down into the engine. I'm going to start by removing these dowels. They just come right out. Hopefully they just come right out. There we go. I'm going to use some brake cleaner. I'll link this down in the description. Any kind of degreaser will do. Before I get to that, I think I'll clean the cylinder head mating surface last. And I'm going to work on both the intake and exhaust side first and take care of this. Now, this is also MLS gasket material, neighborhood, whatever I want to call it. Anyway, I'm using a plastic roll-lock disc for this. Even after it's cleaned, it's still pretty chunky, but I think it'll be fine. My biggest concern, and you probably saw me put my hand up here like this, was getting debris down inside the engine, which honestly there was a little bit. I don't think it's going to be super harmful, but if you're super concerned about it, I might take the valve cover and bolt it back down, and that will hopefully help alleviate that issue. Let's see what the intake says. I might do something similar over here. Looks like these are the EGR passages. Yeah, if you have one of these Civics, EGR cleaning may be a part of your life, especially at high mileage. Looks like these things get gooped up pretty good. It's a brand new Scotch pad. These make life so much easier when doing cylinder head work. Should be able to make some better progress now. Actually, it'd be even easier if I took the studs out. A couple of different ways to go about this. You can use the 2-nut method, which I've shown in the past, and I'll link that video in the description for you. Or you can use stud removal sockets, which here's a set here. This will be linked in the description. Well, that opens things up nicely. Whoa, hey, don't go anywhere, I'm working on you. I think my shop vac will take care of all that debris. That looks pretty. Just gonna blow this off with some compressed air first, especially these holes. Could have gotten liquid in them, like that. All you need to do with studs is snug them up. You don't need to super tighten them. The intake and exhaust are done. Let's see if we can get this guy cleaned up. If you're wondering why I didn't take the studs off for the exhaust manifold, I'm not as concerned about the sealing on that side as I am on the intake. For one, it's easy to get to, and for two, well, it's chunky to begin with, so it is what it is. But I do believe I have this cleaned up to my satisfaction. I'm gonna see if I can address this little bitty divot here. Try and alleviate. These are oil returns, or this one in particular is an oil return. So as the oil was returning, it was wicking through the gasket and going past that spot. So now let's see if I can address that. And that's one of the reasons why I don't want to use any heavy abrasives or any mechanical abrasives in particular on this, because I want to avoid anything just like this. The closer the surface is to a mirror-like finish, the better. I'm gonna try some of this. You can build this up like bodywork and use it for bodywork, and it's an adhesive for metal. So I think this will help fill in that gap, much like you would body filler in a body. And this isn't sealing back combustion or anything, so I'm not, just that little dab there. In fact, what I might even do is do that. Try and make it so that I just fill it in. Less I have to sand after, the better. I think that's filled in. While that sets up, I'm gonna deal with this EGR gunk inside the intake. Remember, I already reinstalled the oil filter to keep junk from getting in the engine. For gunked up carbon, stuff like this, I like to use throttle cleaner. I'm using this particular one right now. I don't think the brand is important. I just like that throttle cleaner seems to have really good carbon busting qualities, and I find that to be helpful when cleaning EGR stuff. This is like the worst right here, look at that. So it seems some of this intake manifold is metal. Not all, but some. That is a world away from what it was. Totally happy with that. I'm gonna go get a clean scrubby pad and just clean off the tops around these cylinders. And you might have noticed I came in here with a little brake clean earlier and cleaned off a little more of this oil residue. Clean it, clean it, clean it. You can get a job as a dishwasher if the mechanic thing doesn't work out. Okay, I'm breaking my rule and I'm going for the roll lock with a very light touch. I think that turned out rather well. Now that the surface is clean, I'm going to install the dowels in the front. This has had a little bit of time to set up on the cylinder head. Now I'm going to see if I can sand that down smooth so that hopefully it doesn't leak anymore. This is a 120 grit sanding block that I'll be using for this with a very light touch. I'm just looking to sand down what's here. The cure time at this point is, I would say, about an hour. I don't feel any high spots really on this anymore. I feel that if you go too far, it's too far, and there's no coming back from that. So I'd rather have it raised up ever so slightly. But to try and smooth out the rest of this, I'm actually gonna get some wet sanding paper and just sort of polish a little bit around this, and then I'll call it done. This is 600 grit paper. This will help keep things square. I just want to get rid of some of these scratches and polish out this surface a little bit. And this will help keep things flat and square. If you just use your finger, it's rounded, so it's not gonna come out as well. In fact, if you can get a large piece of wood or something like that, then well, this is pretty close, that covers this whole surface, that is like the ideal situation. That way you avoid any anomalies or irregularities. Because you want to keep this surface straight and true. And this is very light pressure that I'm applying. I think that came out super nice. I'm just gonna go over the rest of the cylinder head. Again, this is all a very light touch. But as far as this crack goes, I think we've leveled that guy out. I'm thinking that solved our oil leak, which is why we're here to begin with. And if we're not fixing the stuff that we're here for, what are we doing? I think that'll be fine. One more bit of prep on this cylinder head before I install it. You might remember the tube with the O-ring that actually goes across the back of the engine block to the back of the water pump, comes into this area, and it had an O-ring seal in here. Before I reinstall that O-ring, which I believe is fine, I'm gonna clean that off also. I wanna get rid of any crusties that are inside of this bore. I'm gonna use the same Scotch-Brite pad to do that. So just make sure there aren't any crusties or anything on the entrance for this connection. I'm also gonna clean these radiator hose connections off while I'm at it, and I got this in my hand. I find that using blue coolant reduces this. This had green coolant in it when I first got it. As you saw, I put blue in it since then. Just in my experience, it seems to be less corrosive than the green stuff is. And as I mentioned, I've already installed a brand new Honda thermostat, and I do recommend Honda thermostats over any others. The EGR passage that passes into the intake and then runs the EGR into each one of the cylinders actually starts out right here and goes to the EGR valve, which you may be able to see down here. I'm just gonna make sure that it's clear. Throttle cleaner, again, really good at breaking up carbon. So we'll just let this fester in here for a bit. Usually the problems that I see are more towards the cylinders. The exhaust gas is still pretty hot in this part, so I don't normally see problems like at the valve, but I do see them further down the line where things start to cool off. I'm also going to clean this O-ring too. And before it gets installed, I'll put silicone paste on the O-ring. That'll help it go in easier. The exhaust manifold's been repaired. Everything is cleaned and degreased and ready for assembly pretty much. Before I put the head gasket on and the cylinder head, I'm going to go in here and put that silicone paste around the outside of this O-ring just because it's accessible now. It can be a little confusing figuring out which way the head gasket gets installed. Sometimes they're marked with an up. This one is not that I can see. But looking at the configuration on the engine block, there really is only one way for this to go on, and I believe it to be just like this. I only wish it would go over these dowels easier. Take the dowels out. See how they like that. This is an aftermarket gasket, and that may have everything to do with this. That worked nicely. Specifically what I was looking at to determine that this can only go on one way. You see this square passage over here and the round one over here? Like I said, it can only go on one way. Now I'm also gonna take a little bit of WD-40. I should have done this before I laid the gasket down, but I think it'll be fine. And I'm just gonna put this around the tops of the pistons and the piston rings. And this will help lubricate things on first startup. I actually use WD-40 as an assembly lube. Not too much, just enough to coat it. And this will help things when it first starts up. When I go to place this on the engine block, I'm also going to try to thread the studs through the intake manifold so that it's not stressing things out. And I think there's no better time to install the intake gasket than now. Here's the intake gasket that I'm using. I will put part numbers, including the head gasket, down in the description to make this stuff easier for you to find, and even links where necessary. The reason I'm showing you this is because it's got these rubber inserts here as well as the metal gasket. The metal gasket goes in here, but because the intake is two parts, one part of it is metal that has that EGR passage I just cleaned out. The other part is plastic. I believe these rubber pieces go in between those. Now, I didn't open that up or disturb it. I'm not going to bother with the rubber ones, but you can go there if you want to. I will be installing the new intake gasket though. And like the head gasket, this really goes on one way, and there's that EGR passage that can help you locate it. It's nice that these studs are long because this will stay on there while I drop it down on top of the engine. Like I said, I'm going to try to line the studs up as I drop this down on here. Thankfully, it's not that heavy. This AC line is a total pain though. There we are. That seemed to go together nicely. I don't believe there was any damage to any of this, which, yeah, I was concerned. It's really just a matter of bolting all this stuff back up. So let's get to that. I'm going to install the cylinder head bolts now. These are all nice and clean, so I don't feel the need to clean them. I'll add a little bit of oil underneath each one of the heads between where the washer goes. I also sometimes add like a drop of oil to the threads. And this is just regular motor oil. I believe these are all the same length. And again, they're not torque to yield, so you do not need to replace them. But if you do see like there's gunk on the threads or anything like that, clean the threads before installing the bolts. You could even use like ARP assembly lube for this. That actually might be excellent. Now, I'm just running these down at the moment just to snug them up against the cylinder head. But when you do tighten things down, you want to tighten from the center outward. I usually spiral out. I'll start in here, come out to these, and then out to these. And that's what I'll normally do. Very similar to what you're seeing here. Now these will get torqued down in the sequence that I showed you from the center out in 3 different steps. The first step, torque them down to 14 pound-feet. The second step, tighten them down to 36 pound-feet. And then the final step, the final torque will be 49 pound-feet. Notice how those middle ones got looser. I always go back and redo it after, for this very reason. Now to 36. And now for the final torque of 49 foot-pounds. The engine is once again whole. Well, almost. It's got some stuff to put together with it, but the long block is done. Yay! I'm not going to be covering the reassembly in detail. I've pretty much covered that during the disassembly. It's just the opposite of what I did. As far as a torque spec for intake manifold, I'm going to put it somewhere between 15 and 20 foot-pounds, and that's just a guess on my part. I really don't know, but I challenge you to get a torque wrench down in there. Either way, I think that gives you some kind of ballpark. The only other thing is reinstalling the timing belt. Make sure that both the crank and cam pulleys are in time before you commit to that. And that auto tensioner works the same as it did the way I removed it. You just basically move it over to create enough slack so you can slip it over the top gear. Again, make sure everything's in time. But I think I'm going to time lapse you from here on out until we get to the point where we're ready to start it up. And well, we'll see if all this worked, and hopefully that leak is gone. Welcome back, viewers. Everything has been reinstalled with the exception of the battery and the air box. I'm going to put the battery in it now, top off the coolant, and then we'll start it up and see how it runs. Hopefully it still runs. I've already done this, but you might take the opportunity to clean your battery terminals now too. This is all I really ever do to prevent corrosion on battery terminals, and it usually works pretty good. This is just grease, regular old grease, multi-purpose grease. I'll be taking one more precaution when reusing my old coolant, and this is funnels that you can get to strain paint. I just picked up a thing of these, and actually they come in pretty useful. But Honda coolant's not cheap. I don't know, waste it if I don't have to. It does a pretty good job of filtering out debris too. To make filling this easier, was going kind of slow. I disconnected this line from up here. It's going to act kind of like a bleeder valve so that I can fill the system more efficiently. Once the coolant starts coming out of here, I'll stop, reattach this, and well, it should be full enough for me to start it up. And it was right there, like right there. So bleeder valves just make filling the system easier, and that's how you do it with the engine off when you're first filling it up. It allows the air to escape as the coolant goes in, because the coolant is displacing the air and all that stuff we just took apart. Well, I think it's time to fire this thing up and see if it still lives. I'm optimistic. That sounds happy. When I did the timing belt and water pump, I adjusted the valves. I might have mentioned that already, so I didn't bother doing that this time, but it is a great opportunity to do that after doing this kind of work. No check engine lights, nothing. That's a good sign. Now I'll bleed the air out of the cooling system and drive it around for a while, and we'll recheck to see if we were successful in our repair. We'll see you then. I should also mention I installed a new coolant temperature sensor, or Honda calls it a TW, or temperature water sensor. The part number is displayed on your screen right now, also down in the description. Also, it's not uncommon to see, you might be able to see the smoke here that's coming off the engine. When you take all this stuff apart and you've got new paint and everything, you'll see this kind of smoke for a little bit. But if it lasts past a day, or a few hundred miles of driving, or just like 50 miles of driving, then look into it further. But you definitely want to go around and check for any leaks or any issues after doing this amount of work to an engine. So far things look pretty good on this engine. Welcome back, viewers. This is the engine and transmission after roughly 1,200 miles of driving. My son and I drove it down to the Import Alliance show down in Atlanta last weekend, and we obviously put some miles on it. So here it is after just about 1,200 miles with no leaks, no drips, no seeps, no evidence of anything whatsoever as far as oil leakage is concerned from the engine or the transmission. I feel like I've finally exorcised its oil leaking demons. Here's a summary of what was causing those leaks on the back of the engine and also from the front of the transmission. While inspecting the rear of the engine, I found that the rear main seal on the outside was leaking, not the inside where it seals against the crankshaft. It appears that the previous person who had replaced that seal pried it out from the outside, and in doing so gouged up that surface and made a path for the oil to leave. I sanded it down a little bit, added a little bit of RTV before installing the new seal. I've installed a new seal, and that engine oil leak seems to be dealt with. Now the transmission, that was a little tricky, but I removed the transmission and took everything apart, and I took a look at the input shaft seal. I didn't see any issues there, but there was a little bit of scoring that was left from the old seal on the input shaft. And for that, I took some crocus cloth and sanded that down as smooth as I possibly could. Also, when installing the new seal into the transmission, I didn't sink it all the way down in. And I didn't do that so that it would rest on a slightly different spot of the input shaft that wasn't all scored up from the previous seal. Those actions seem to have eliminated that oil leak on the front of the transmission, and that did contaminate the clutch, so I also ended up replacing the clutch while I was in there. But the replacement of the seal in the front of the transmission and repairing the housing for the rear main seal seems to have cured the oil leak problems. And now the 2005 Honda Civic with a 1.7 liter is oil leak free. Finally. The head gasket was contributing to the oil leak on this engine for sure. I mean, you saw the damage that was there. I think the takeaway from all of this is be careful while you're working, because you don't want to cause damage while you're trying to fix something. And both the head gasket leak and the rear main seal leak, well, partly the rear main seal leak I'm going to blame on me for not catching that when I put the last rear main seal in it, but I'm going to be looking for that kind of thing from now on, and I hope you do too. I hope watching this video gave you that experience by proxy. I don't often find that MLS gaskets leak, either with head gaskets or with coolant or with oil. As you saw in this video, it was an external force that caused this oil leak. Anyway, all of that stuff has been resolved. It's all back together. 1,200 miles later, no leaks. I'm hoping they are banished forever. Links in the description to additional videos, tools, information. So check the description for more stuff, including a link to EricTheCarGuy.com, which is where I ask you go if you have automotive questions. Thank you so much for watching today. Remember, I post videos on Fridays, so stop back and see me then. Be safe, have fun, stay dirty, and I will see you next time.